Hey everybody, today I'm going to be responding to this Muslim who wants to cast doubt on the Gospels, while his own book rewrites history with a 600-year-later conspiracy theory.
In the three synoptic Gospels, namely Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus goes to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover, eats the Passover meal, and dies on the day of Passover. We will focus on the Gospel of Mark to avoid any confusion. In the Gospel of John, however, Jesus does not die on Passover, but rather dies on the day of preparation for Passover. In Jewish custom, the day ends at sundown and the new day starts at nightfall. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus gives his disciples instructions to prepare for the Passover. Then at the evening, they have the Passover meal in the upper room. After that, he is arrested, spends the night in jail, and in the morning time, he is crucified at about 9 a.m. Jesus then dies on the day of the Passover, the morning after Passover meal was eaten. In John's Gospel, Jesus also travels to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover in the last week of his life. However, the disciples don't ask him how they will prepare for the Passover in this account. Jesus eats a last meal with the disciples. He is betrayed by Judas, arrested, spends the night in jail, and is condemned to be crucified. In John 19:14, it says, "It was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about noon. Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews. The day of preparation, Passover, when the lambs are slaughtered and before the meal is eaten, at noon, how on earth could that be?
His entire argument hinges on a misreading of John 19:14, where he assumes the day of preparation for the Passover means the day before Passover itself, but that's not what the term meant in Jewish usage. In first century Judaism, day of preparation was the standard term for Friday, the day before the Sabbath. This is explicitly confirmed in Mark 15:42, which says, "And when evening had come, since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath." And John makes himself even clearer in John 19:31. Since it was the day of preparation, and so that the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day. John is not saying Jesus was crucified the day before Passover. He's saying he was crucified on Friday, the day before the Sabbath. John even notes that this was a high day, meaning it was a special Sabbath that fell during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. This actually perfectly aligns with Mark's timeline. But did Jesus die at 9 a.m. or noon? Both are approximations. Jews divided daylight into 3-hour blocks, so Mark's third hour, 9 a.m., could mean any time until noon, while John rounds up to about the 6th hour, which is noon. There's no contradiction here.
Just to confirm we're reading this right, in John 18:28, it says that the Jews hadn't yet eaten the Passover meal. In John, Jesus dies a day early, sometime after noon. Some will indicate that in Mark, it also says that Jesus died on a day called the Day of Preparation. But what these readers fail to realize is that Mark tells us what he means by that. The day of preparation for the Sabbath, not for the Passover, because one had to prepare a day before the Sabbath day.
Okay, so Libiano seems to anticipate the counter-argument, but he never actually refutes it. He just restates his position as if that solves the problems. But a key flaw in his reasoning is that he assumes Passover in John 18:28 must refer only to the Seder meal. But in first century Jewish usage, Passover often referred to the entire Feast of Unleavened Bread, not just the first night's meal. This isn't just speculation, it's confirmed by Josephus, a first century Jewish historian. So when John 18:28 says that the Jewish leaders hadn't eaten the Passover, it doesn't mean that the Seder was still ahead. It could easily refer to another festival meal, such as the Hagigah, a sacrificial meal eaten the next day. This completely dismantles the alleged contradiction. The Passover Seder had already taken place the night before, just as Mark records, and the Jewish leaders were concerned about a different meal in the Passover festival.
To recap, in Mark, Jesus eats the Passover meal Thursday night, is crucified the following morning at around 9 a.m. In John, Jesus does not eat the Passover meal and is crucified on the day before the Passover meal is eaten.
But John doesn't say that Jesus skipped the Passover meal. John 13:1 sets this stage before the Feast of the Passover. Then 13:2 says, during supper, the meal is already underway. There's no indication that it wasn't the Passover. John and Mark also line up on the timeline. John 12:1 says Jesus arrived in Bethany 6 days before Passover. John 12:12 through 13 says the next day he entered Jerusalem. That's 5 days before. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Mark 11 through 14 follows the same timeline, but without giving specific day counts. Mark 11:12 through 19 says the next day the fig tree was cursed, the temple was cleared, so we have 4 days before. Then in Mark 11:20 through 13:37, we see the following morning. The tree is withered. There is some temple teaching 3 days before. Then in Mark 14:1, it says 2 days before the Passover. So John gives the dates, Mark gives the flow. They actually line up perfectly, not because one copied the other, but because they're both reporting what actually happened. This is what eyewitness testimony actually looks like. There are actually two more undesigned coincidences that show the Last Supper in John 13 is the same meal described in the Synoptic Gospels. First, in Luke 22:27, Jesus says, "I am among you as the one who serves." But Luke doesn't explain what he means. Over in John 13:4-5, we get the missing detail. Jesus actually gets up, takes a towel, and washes the disciples' feet. John gives the action, and Luke gives the commentary, but neither mentions the other's detail, but they fit together perfectly. And then in Luke 22:24, we're told the disciples had just argued about who was the greatest. So that explains why Jesus gave them a lesson in humility. But John never mentions the argument, just the foot washing. So Luke gives the reason, but John gives the response. Two different authors, two angles, yet the details connect seamlessly. That's not what you would expect from corrupted fictions. This is what actual historical memory looks like.
The reason why John changes this detail is clear. In John, Jesus is the Passover lamb. John needs Jesus to die on the day when the lambs were slaughtered to convey a theological point.
But there's zero historical evidence that Passover lambs were sacrificed at noon. Every actual Jewish source places it later in the day. If all the historical sources agree that the lambs weren't sacrificed at noon, then John couldn't have been shifting the timeline for theological reasons because there's no reason to shift it. Orthodox Muslim just recycles a bad Bart Ehrman objection, not realizing how weak that it actually is. And even Ehrman admits that, contradiction or not, it doesn't erase the fact that Jesus was actually crucified.